This CIRS podcast is part of a web-based project focusing on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the Gulf and the broader Middle East. The goal of the project is to provide a focused understanding of how the region is being affected by and how it's responding to the ongoing global crisis. I'm Susie Marigani, Assistant Director for Publications at CIRS, the Center for International Regional Studies at Georgetown University in Qatar. Our guest for today is Professor Simon Chadwick. Chadwick is Director of Eurasian Sport and Director of the Center for the Eurasian Sport Industry at Emlyon Business School, based in Paris and Shanghai. He's also Senior Fellow at the China Policy Institute, University of Nottingham, where he's Founding Director of the China Soccer Observatory. Chadwick previously worked as Director of Research for the Josoor Institute in Qatar, which is part of the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, the institute organizing the 2022 World Cup. Chadwick has been part of two previous CIRS projects, Sport, Society and Politics in the Middle East, and more recently, Football in the Middle East. Welcome, Simon. Thanks for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts about some of the impacts of the current pandemic on sports in the Gulf. So to begin with, the COVID-19 pandemic caused serious disruptions to sporting events across the world, but more specifically, how has it affected sports in the GCC?
Good question, and I'm going to give you an incredibly professional and professorial answer, which is, I don't know. And although I say this somewhat flippantly, I also say it rather seriously as well, because we're obviously living in an age where it's difficult to predict anything. We've been waiting for quite a long time in Europe now for football matches to start, and we've had this, will they start or won't they start? Germany is starting this weekend. Quite when English football matches will start again, it remains to be seen. And I think this level of uncertainty we're also seeing across the Gulf region and across Gulf sport too. The reason that I'm uncertain what's going to happen next is at one level, obviously, sport is absolutely crucial to the region, not just in terms of people watching it and people participating in sport, because I think just as in the same way as in Britain or France or wherever else in the world, in places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, sport is woven into the fabric of society. People like talking about it, they like watching it. In many cases, they like to do it. So I think there's significant unpredictability right now in sport, not just across the Gulf region, but across the world. We've obviously had some very high profile cases, the most obvious being the Olympic Games being postponed from this year to next. And we've seen this too across the Gulf region as well, in terms of, take one example there, the Bahrain F1 Grand Prix. Not taking place, but equally we've had football leagues not taking place. We've had things like national sports days not taking place as a consequence of the virus. So at the moment we're in a great period of uncertainty. I think that uncertainty is born of really two things. I think on the one hand, sport is obviously really important to the Gulf region and to the Middle East in general. Certainly amongst those Gulf nations. What we have is a series of national visions. We have sport really being written into the policy and strategy that is being used to pursue those national visions. And so at one level, sport is so important to the Gulf region. It's so important politically, industrially, economically, but I think socioculturally and in terms of health too, that one really can't imagine that the likes of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, Dubai stepping back from sport. But at the same time, there are major obstacles, major challenges ahead. So if nothing else, there's no sport taking place, which is a big issue. But as we know, given the levels of debt that are now being accumulated in the region, allied to the fall in oil price, we've really got to question whether or not the kind of spending commitments that have been made to sport across the region will continue, whether they can be sustained. And if we look at just this week, and when I say just this week, we're in the week of second or third week of May, and we've seen Saudi Arabia making significant statements about cuts in public expenditure. And the Saudi Arabian finance minister has actually made a statement that spending on sport will have to be cut. Now, quite what that means remains to be seen, and be interesting to see whether or not that means major infrastructural projects like Qiddiya, which is a major sports city being developed just to the north of Riyadh, or will cuts to sport expenditure mean less spending on public health programs, less spending on sports facilities for the population. So when I say that I'm uncertain, I don't know what's going to happen, it is almost as though my heart tells me that Gulf nations will continue to spend on sport, but my head is telling me that economically, financially, there will be cuts to spending.
Well, let's just talk a little bit more about the finances. Do you think, with the current pandemic happening in the region and globally, that countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar will continue investing in international sporting teams like Newcastle and Paris Saint Germain and so on?
You've actually made a very interesting observation there, and made a distinction between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. I think what is very noticeable about Qatar is it is invested externally. So it's invested in overseas sports assets. So for instance, if we take Paris Saint Germain as the most obvious example, which Qatar has been invested into now for almost a decade. At the same time, we've seen significant investments by Qatar into sponsorships. Qatar Airways at Roma, Qatar Airways at Boca Juniors, for example, are two cases. We've also seen Qatar investing heavily into equine sports. And so across Europe, significant interests in stables, in races, have been acquired by the Qatari investment authorities. Now, if we contrast that with Saudi Arabia is different because thus far, Saudi Arabian investment into sport seems to have had a predominantly domestic focus. So we take two major infrastructural projects at the moment, Qiddiya and Neom, both of which are costing in excess of $500 million to construct. So we're looking at sizable sums of money, but they're essentially focused on drawing in events and tourists related to sport into Saudi Arabia. What we haven't seen, for example, is the Saudi Arabian government buying football teams. We've not seen Saudia, the national airline, sponsoring overseas sports properties. So I think there's a fundamental distinction anyway between the two. And there are geopolitical reasons for that. I think there are reasons of risk mitigation for that. You know, Saudi Arabia is a very different country to Qatar. But what we have seen this year, twice, firstly in January and secondly during the pandemic period, is stories beginning to emerge that Saudi Arabia, through its public investment fund, has made a bid to acquire Newcastle United, a Premier League team. Now, this is a hugely controversial issue in Britain, and I think to a certain extent across Europe too. I think there is some sense of the controversy as well in the Gulf region, principally because of the be in and be out queue issue that surrounds this. I remain unconvinced about the credibility of reporting and stories around the Saudi Arabia Newcastle United deal. But assuming that this is about to go ahead, it's a major policy departure for Saudi Arabia, because, as I say, thus far they haven't invested internationally. They've invested domestically. But I think for any football fans, principally in Newcastle, but I guess in the Middle East and more generally, who anticipate a Qatari-style spending spree similar to Paris Saint-Germain, or an Abu Dhabi-style spending spree similar to that we've seen at Manchester City. I think because of current economic conditions, I think because of the oil price, because of the levels of debt in the Gulf region, we're not going to be seeing Newcastle United, if they are purchased by the Saudi Arabians, going out and buying Mbappe from Paris Saint-Germain, or buying Griezmann from Barcelona. I think fiscal pressures will moderate what the Saudi Arabians can do in the northeast.
Thank you for that. And so the current disruptions to sport, both internationally and in the region, how has this affected companies like beIN?
That's a really great question. So if we talk specifically about the issue of the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund's proposed acquisition of Newcastle United, just to set a little bit of context for people. During 2018, specifically the World Cup, set in the context of the ongoing Gulf feud, it became apparent that somebody or something was pirating beIN's official content. So in other words, they were stealing beIN's official content, repackaging it, rebranding it, and making this available not just in the Gulf region but across the world. I had a very interesting conversation with somebody in China who said it's possible to access beOutQ's content in China. And I think this is a situation that is being replicated across the world. Now, inevitably, beIN responded to that and has sought to chase this down, is seeking to take legal action. But certainly in the context of the Newcastle United Saudi Arabian deal, what's significant about this is that the Premier League has a contractual relationship with beIN that sees contractual relationships and content being sold across 20 different territories. So not only is this a contractual relationship, beIN is a very important commercial partner of the Premier Leagues. At the same time, several football governing bodies across the world, including the Premier League, have made very strident statements about piracy and the theft of content. The problem we now see for the Premier League is the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund has to make an application through something called the fit and proper person test to acquire a football club, which the Premier League needs to approve. So the Premier League is in this invidious position of condemning piracy and being a victim of piracy, but at the same time assessing the financial worthiness of the deal, which we know is associated with Saudi Arabia as well. And so there's a clear conflict of interest and a clear predicament there for the Premier League to deal with. So that's a little bit about the relationship between beIN, beOut, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Premier League in general. But I think the second response to your question that I would give is we're living in really strange times, because one might have imagined that throughout this, people's TV viewing habits would have been what sustained them through the pandemic. I think the first thing to say is obviously there's been nothing to show. And so we've been living on a diet of nostalgia. And I think there's something really interesting here about the role that nostalgia has played in the pandemic. So endless reruns of great games, of great goals, of great players. How that has impacted upon people's attitudes and behaviors will be interesting to see as we begin to emerge from the pandemic. But what seems to be the case, and the data is bearing this out in places like China, for instance, I think we're seeing it too in the Gulf region, but certainly we're also seeing it in Europe, is the role that digital subscription services are now playing. And certainly I've been reading a report just over the last 24 hours that has come out of China that suggests that 20% of Chinese cinemas will close because people no longer want to go to the cinema. What they want to do is on their device at home or on their mobile handset, they want to watch content which they subscribe to and they can watch on demand anywhere at any time. So in those terms, my question would be to anybody with an interest in sport, anybody with an interest in broadcasting, anyone with an interest in digital content consumption is, are we necessarily going to go back to the world that we came from? And my personal answer to that question is no. And we then get into this whole issue around how will people consume their sport? Will it be on TV? Will it be by satellite TV? Will it be a kind of subscription-based Netflix type service? And I think alongside this, we've also got to ask the question, will people go to stadiums as well? There was another survey approximately 4 or 5 weeks ago coming out of the United States, where 70% of sports fans who were surveyed said that until such time that a vaccine is developed for COVID-19, they won't go back to a sports stadium. Now, if that is true, and that is replicated across the whole world, then, you know, if we take the Premier League as one example, very often games have been played at maximum capacity utilization. So in other words, 75,000 capacity at Manchester United, 75,000 people there. If people are saying we're not going, you know, crowds are then down to 5,000 or 10,000. You know, it really challenges the broadcasting, digital content and consumption landscape and the business models that underpin those things significantly. So, you know, we live in a period of uncertainty, and when those first games take place, it's going to be really interesting to see what the consequences are.
Absolutely, and really changes the nature of the relationship between the fan and the sport.
There are some really this is what sustained me. So there's no on-field action, so it's the off-field action that sustained me through this. There are some really interesting examples now of things that are taking place. So we've seen, for example, a club in Denmark providing drive-in football. So what they're proposing is that games will be played and there'll be nobody inside the stadium, but outside the stadium, there will be screens and people will be able to park their cars and watch the game on the screen. So driving football, which is kind of, you know, going back to 1950s driving American movies. We've also seen, for example, and this is one of the initiatives being used this coming weekend in the Bundesliga in Germany. One of the Bundesliga clubs has been selling to fans $20 cardboard cutouts. So Simon Chadwick, I'm a fan of Borussia Mönchengladbach, let's say. I can pay $20 or 20 euros, get a cardboard cutout made of my face and body, so I can be sat in the stadium when the games are being played. So that is also interesting. We're also seeing another case in the Premier League of one club proposing CGI crowds. So crowds that look the same and move the same and hurl the same levels of abuse and have the same amount of noise, but
I'm sure not.
In England, believe me, maybe not in the Gulf region, but definitely in England and in Europe more generally. So yeah, we are potentially on the verge of having CGI crowds, which again is kind of mind blowing. So I guess this is although it's a really uncertain period of history, it's also an amazing period of history because it is almost as though anything is possible. I'm a big movie buff as well as a sports fan, and two films in particular keep crossing my mind. The first one is Blade Runner 1, not the new Blade Runner, the 1982 Harrison Ford Blade Runner, and the second one is The Fifth Element, the Luc Besson film from the 1990s. For anybody who's watching who's never seen Blade Runner from 82 or Fifth Element from the late 90s, watch these movies, because a lot of what we're now living through and what a lot of what people are now proposing as the next step, certainly in sport, I just tend to think, hey, we're living in a sci-fi movie.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we might get to a point where virtual gaming or virtual football is as popular as live games.
Susie, you like to ask a challenging question. That again is a really great question. The most obvious thing to say about what's happening, and or to put it another way, the net beneficiary of what has been happening, you would tend to think is console gaming. You would tend to think is the emergence of digital sport. And certainly if you look at, again, some of the figures coming out of Asia in particular, but I think Europe and North America as well, these young people in particular are spending huge amounts of time console gaming. But I think what's been striking is that arguably just as strong, if not stronger, has been the growth of content consumption on, for example, Netflix. So I don't think that we can necessarily assume that the console gaming and esports are going to be the net beneficiaries. And I think, well, what has been particularly interesting, certainly here in the UK when it comes to esports, is there was a plan this year to roll out a kind of regional structure for esports. So in other words, there would be different teams from different regions. So you get a similar kind of, you get an almost like an Al Sadd versus Al Rayyan type contest online. Yet those plans were suspended here in Britain because it was felt that the regionalisation and the creation of a league structure around esports simply wouldn't work in the middle of a pandemic. So again, our natural inclination might be to say, well, it's all moving online. It's all going to be about watching sport and competing in sport online. But I don't think that's necessarily going to be the obvious outcome. And as I say, I think everything is up for grabs. And a crucial part of this, as somebody who works in a business school, a crucial part of this, I think, is which organizations, which clubs, which teams, which governing bodies, which leagues, which competitions, which sponsors, which broadcasters, which commercial partners have got the best exit strategies for the pandemic. Because just as politicians are being challenged to think about the best way out of this, I think a lot of organizations in sport are equally being challenged to identify the best way out of this. And I don't necessarily think that's by moving online. I don't necessarily think either it's about kind of returning completely to normal and we all pile into a sports stadium somewhere when this is all over. I think what we're going to see is hybrid models and different ways of doing things, different business models, and those that survive, those that prosper, those that grow will have that work through in their minds right now.
So do you think that current GCC governments are seriously thinking now in the near future about strategies that they can adopt regarding sports in the region?
Let me answer that in this way. I am a big fan of the way in which countries in the GCC view sport. I'm a big fan. Now, I know there are reasons why governments in the GCC region can pursue sports policies in the way that they do. That, for example, European Union nations, and I include Britain in that for the time being, we don't pursue policies in the same way, and there are reasons for that. But I'm always very impressed by the GCC and the way they go about this, because they have a long-term visionary view of sport. They think very carefully about policy and strategy, and I think they have the resources, or certainly have had the resources, to acquire the expertise that enables the implementation and management of these sports strategies. And so, fingers crossed, because I really care about the region and I really care about sport in the region. Fingers crossed this continues. And certainly, if you look at some of the projects, if you look at the World Cup in Qatar, you look at the development of infrastructure and projects in Saudi Arabia. If you look at some of the things that, for example, Abu Dhabi is doing around motorsport, I genuinely hope that these countries stay focused, they remain committed, and that they learn to adapt what they're doing in sport, and that they're able to realize their visions. But I do worry. As I say, we've heard statements from the Saudi Arabian finance minister this week questioning whether the levels of financial commitment to sport can be sustained. As I've already mentioned, we've seen the likes of the Bahrain F1 Grand Prix being cancelled. We've seen numerous other events being cancelled. We have to see the Qatar World Cup in terms of risk and threat, I think, because although it's 2.5 years away, if we still haven't developed a vaccine, and if the virus is still circulating, there is a level of risk, there is a threat to the Qatar World Cup, and that will fundamentally challenge how the event is staged. And given the level of investment that Qatar has made to winning the right and developing the infrastructure for the World Cup, that's a big issue. That's a really, really important issue. So I think looking ahead, being optimistic about it, GCC, sport, its government's vision, policy, strategy, long may it continue. But as a supporter of and a firm advocate for the kind of approaches that have been adopted in the Gulf, I'm worried. I am worried because I can see that not just the pandemic, but the fallout of the pandemic, all of this accumulation poses a serious risk to some of the things that are happening in the Gulf.
But that's exactly what my next question is about. How will the pandemic, do you think, affect the World Cup in Qatar in 2022? And that's right around the corner.
We've already got a series of unresolved issues around the Qatar World Cup, like, for example, Budweiser, an alcohol producer, an alcohol brand, which is a FIFA partner, will want people to consume alcohol at the World Cup because traditionally, historically, that's what happens at World Cups. And I've heard lots of possible scenarios for enabling Budweiser to serve alcohol in Qatar, but as far as I'm aware, nothing has been agreed. But what you're now potentially talking about is not just the issue of alcohol and crowds in downtown Doha. You're also throwing into the mix COVID-19 and the threat of infection into that as well. And so, kind of logistically, operationally, COVID-19 complicates an already complicated situation. And I'm sure people are thinking about this. I'm sure that the Supreme Committee and sponsors, commercial partners, event organizers are thinking carefully about how to deal with this. There will be a solution, but I guess from my point of view is I'm keen to understand what that solution might look like. But I think more existentially, strategically, it's an interesting one. If we may draw a comparison with the Tokyo Olympics, for a long time, the Japanese government said, we want to host. Now, what was interesting about this is what a lot of people didn't realize is that Shinzo Abe has to fight an election later this year. And so Abe was looking for the economic bounce and the feel-good factor created by the Olympics and Paralympics as a platform then to conduct his election campaign in September. And so he fought this for a long time. And when eventually he had to concede that there would need to be a postponement, very, very quickly, we saw a spike in the Japanese numbers for COVID-19. So when it was obvious there was going to be no bounce, no feel-good factor this year for Abe, the numbers spiked. There is a political process behind mega event hosting that I think Qatar will also have to confront as well. Now, I know that the electoral system, the political system in Qatar is different, but nevertheless, there'll be a political context to this. But what I find interesting about Tokyo since then is what went from being Abe saying, yes, it can take place this year, to then moving towards postponement. But what we're now beginning to hear is stories of actually the event just being cancelled. And so there are rumors that Olympic Games 2021, Paralympic Games 2021 will just be cancelled. Now, for Abe politically, this is significant, but in terms of the economic and infrastructural investments Japan have made, and Japan have invested huge amounts of money in infrastructure, almost comparable with Qatar. This is a major issue, and so we're no longer just talking about operational and kind of logistical issues like alcohol and Budweiser. We are talking about now existential threat. Now, I've not spoken to anyone in the Supreme Committee about this, and I'm sure the Supreme Committee are holding the line. Yes, November, December 2022, it will all be fine. It will be good. If it's not, we'll look at managing that situation. Worst case scenario, what we'll do is maybe there'll be postponement to 2023, possibly. But such is the unknown and unpredictable nature of the situation that we now find ourselves in. The apocalyptic scenario for Qatar is cancellation. And as I say, Tokyo is dealing with this. Tokyo is grappling with this. It may be, and I emphasize the word may, it may be at some stage that the Supreme Committee, the government in Qatar, has to confront the possibility of an apocalyptic scenario and how the country deals with that.
So how do you see the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, impacting GCC airline investments in sports sponsorships?
Gulf region airlines are deeply, deeply embedded in sport, particularly in football. And if we think about Emirates Airlines at Real Madrid, we think about Qatar Airways at Roma, we think about Etihad at Manchester City. It is almost now as though they were always there. You know, it's become such a normal thing for people to see these names and to know about these countries that it's hard to imagine them not being around. But it's a really tricky situation right now. Here you have states like Dubai through Emirates Airlines having built perceptions of, having generated soft power around, having instigated industrial change on the back of sports sponsorships. I asked in a webinar a couple of weeks ago, I asked, can you believe this? I asked 350 people in 1995 who'd flown on Emirates Airlines. And out of 350 people, one person had. And then I said, okay, so now how many of you who've flown on Emirates Airlines? And pretty much the whole session put up their hands. And then I asked them, how many of you have transited through Dubai? How many of you have been to Dubai? And you're talking about 60, 65%. Now, obviously that was just a very informal thing. But I think what's really important to realize is that those Gulf region airlines and their sponsorships of sport have been so important to these Gulf nations. It's hard to ever imagine this stopping. They're so intrinsically intertwined with one another. But of course, what's now happening is airlines are not flying, routes are not operating. We've seen Qatar Airways and Etihad, for example, over the last 2 weeks announcing major job losses. They're financially challenged. There are issues around oil prices and the safety of traveling. And so this does pose some really interesting issues for the airlines themselves, what happens next. Because as I say, I think in terms of commercial strategy, in terms of marketing communications, sponsorships have been a really, really important part of what they've been doing over the last 2 decades. But I think what we've also got to keep in mind is for the likes of Real Madrid or AC Milan or Olympique Lyon or Arsenal, all of which are sponsored by Emirates Airlines. And obviously there are others too, Qatar Airways at Roma, Boca Juniors and others. Can those clubs expect the same financial value, the same financial magnitude of deal that they've had so far? And I anticipate that not only is the pandemic changing the landscape for sport more generally, but in specific areas like sponsorship deals, we'll also see some moderation of values and some of the excess of the sector being stripped out as a consequence of what's now happening with the airline industry.
Which might not be a bad thing.
Which might not be a bad thing.
Let me ask you my final question, Simon. How much do you miss sport in this current pandemic period?
I've said it to you before, Susie, about questions and great questions. That's probably the best question of all, because now I'm going to make a confession that may go global. I haven't missed sport on the field at all. At all. I'm really not, it's really had no impact on me whatsoever. I started out as a sports fan. So as a kid and then as a student, and when I first started to work, I was a sports fan. I loved sport. But over the last 2 decades, I've fallen out of love with sport. And what I've fallen in love with is countries and airline sponsorships and how leagues are run and how mega events are staged. And so I think, if anything, over this last, I've been locked down for 7 weeks. In the 7 weeks of the lockdown, I've never worked so hard in my life, because some of the off-field shenanigans have just been incredible. And so for me, this has been almost like a golden age of sport. So yeah, I haven't missed it at all.
You're full of surprises, Simon. That's not the answer I expected, but thank you for giving us a fresh perspective.
Thank you.
Being with us today, Simon, so much.